So thank you to Rich Fontaine. Thank you to CNAS. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is a very happy moment for me to be able to kick off an event on a report by Nick Burns and Doug Lute. Usually Doug Lute is ordering me around, so it's very exciting that he cannot actually move on to his portion until I am done. So that feels good to me. So I've been doing a lot of thinking now that I'm a member of Congress on our alliances and our partnerships, our coalitions, and I think one thing is a very certain assumption we can all make, which is the U.S. is safer when we work in alliances and coalitions. That I take as an assumption. And I think that goes back a long time, basically since World War II. We were safer and better off working in alliances and partnerships in World War II against fascism. We were better during the Cold War when we built. Oh, Lord. Okay. So I go NATO. NATO good. NATO good. The one thing I will leave you with, because we are literally voting on making the Mueller report public, so this is a vote I'm not going to miss. The one thing I would say is, because I do this every time I get a group of insiders together. You must communicate why NATO is important going forward to the middle of the country. You must explain to my dad, who's in the meat business, why NATO is important to his security, his grandkids, his future. And if we do not, and I have to really laud CNAS for being great about getting out into the middle of the country, if we do not do that, and we do not explain what the mission statement is, the affirmative, positive mission statement of NATO going forward, not against something, but for something in the next generation, then we will lose the public support that we still do have. And then we're really in trouble. So that's my one plea. Please take it out of Washington and go communicate it out. Tell my dad why NATO is important. I'm so sorry. I'm thrilled that I'm here for the report, but I must go vote. Apologies. See you later.
Thank you. Direct and to the point, shall we say. So with that, we can move into the rest of the program we have this morning. So why don't I invite our panelists to join here on the stage, and I will sit down in just a moment, but maybe I can just spend 2 minutes trying to pull in a bit of what the Congresswoman said into the broader intent of the session today, and also I think some of the themes in the report that, for those of you who haven't read it, will be able to pick up on here. It's the timeliness of doing something like this and the need for it, I think, is fairly self-evident, from the president having campaigned on his skepticism about the alliance and routinely expressing the view that wealthy European allies are enriching themselves at America's expense and enjoying a security umbrella, while our allies are unwilling to share their fair burden, their fair share of the burden. And we were just talking about this before we came in. The president is certainly the most high-profile sort of skeptic of NATO and alliances in general, I think. But he's not the only one. The New York Times this week had an article by Professor Barry Posen, who and he said, quote, "NATO's founding mission has been achieved and replaced with unsuccessful misadventures like Bosnia, Kosovo, and Libya." And he called for a reappraisal of the transatlantic alliance. It seems to me that the response to this is not to just dismiss these kinds of criticisms as historically ill-informed or the product of a particular short-sightedness, nor just to reject them as sometimes we do by saying, well, it's just a matter of communications. We just don't have a very good communication strategy. If really people understood the way we understand, they would see the value of NATO. That may be true, but it seems to me that that's not the only thing at issue here. Rather, to take these kinds of criticisms seriously and to talk about what how widespread they are? Are Americans really feeling this, or is this sort of idiosyncratic to the president and some academic realists and so forth? And to use the 70th anniversary to really talk about how we might re-energize this alliance and what the future of it might hold. So the folks that we have on the panel here are uniquely qualified to do that. The two authors of this report are here and need no real introduction, but Ambassador Nick Burns, former ambassador to NATO and other places, and served in other distinguished posts as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Ambassador Doug Lute, who served also as ambassador to NATO. The two of them are working at the Belfer Center, among other affiliations. We have Kathleen Hicks, who is the Senior Vice President and Henry Kissinger Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where she directs the International Security Program. And among her senior positions in government, she was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And then CNAS's own Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who directs our Transatlantic Security Program, and prior to joining us at CNAS was the Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. So I'm going to sit down and join the panel here and ask Nick and Doug, maybe you can kick this off with a discussion of sort of the key takeaways from the report. And it may be obvious, but why a report about NATO now, and what do you hope that folks will get out of this?
Good. Well, Richard, thank you very much. I'm Nick Burns. This is Doug Lute, if you didn't know who each one of us are. My partner in crime. I want to thank Richard, thank for CNAS for sponsoring us today. Thank Andrea for making all this happen. We're very grateful. Since government's a team sport, when I served at NATO, I served there with Jim Townsend and John Heffern. And they were the best friends and best colleagues we could have had. We all believe in NATO. We were there on 9/11. When NATO invoked Article 5, when the Allies came to our defense. And for those people who say that NATO is yesterday's story, recent New York Times op-ed by Barry Posen, or that NATO isn't meaningful anymore, it's meaningful, I think, to all of us who were there on 9/11, on the day after, when the Canadians and the Europeans came to our defense. They all went into Afghanistan with us, 1,000 combat deaths, several thousand wounded. They're still there with us. So if we didn't have this alliance, Richard, we'd have to create it for American foreign policy and defense policy going forward. Doug and I are friends. I deeply admire the work that Doug did as President Obama's ambassador to NATO. Doug was there at a consequential time.
By the way, with Jim Townsend and John Heffern 15 years later.
There's a pattern here. Richard, we wrote this report because on April 4th of this year, NATO is going to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Washington Treaty, of its founding. We believe our country should remain for several decades to come, if not more, deeply committed to leading the alliance, and we're worried that we're not doing that. So I'll just say a few words about some of the 10 recommendations that Doug and I made, and then Doug will carry the bulk of it. We spent 6 months on this. We were in Europe talking to senior European government officials and academics and members of parliament, both of the European Parliament and national parliaments. We talked to a number of former cabinet secretaries here and Americans of all stripes, and we conclude that this alliance is critical. There is no defense of the United States or Canada without the NATO alliance. The great insight of Marshall and of Truman and of Atchison in 1949 was that the United States, following the two world wars, could not defend itself unless we were forward deployed in Europe. And that's what NATO represents, and that hasn't changed. And the mission is not complete, despite the fact that some people think it is. How could it be complete when the fate of Eastern Europe is still up for grabs given an assertive Russia? When our responsibility to ourselves and our allies is to defend those people against aggression and the type of aggression that we experienced on 9/11. So an incomplete mission, one that we've got to keep going forward. Our principal conclusion, and it was a sad and bitter one, frankly, for us to reflect upon, and we had hours of discussion about this, that the alliance is in crisis because for the first time in 70 years, we lack a strong, principled American leader. Every president of both parties, from Truman and Eisenhower down to President Obama, deeply believed that one of their principal jobs as President of the United States was to defend the country through this alliance. And President Trump has taken a pass on that. He's the first president who has not backed up our Article 5 commitment. He's had several takes on this in 2017 and 2018 at NATO headquarters when he failed in his first visit there to affirm his belief in Article 5, to Fox News interviews and other times. He's never said it completely and convincingly that he would back up our allies in an Article 5 contingency. He has been the weakest American president of the last 70 years in dealing with the Kremlin. Never criticized Putin for any of the cyber attacks on our country, on the Danes, on the Germans, on the French in the 2017 election. And he has become the most caustic critic of the Democratic leaders within the alliance, small d, Democrats, Angela Merkel, Theresa May, Emmanuel Macron, Justin Trudeau. He never misses an opportunity to criticize them, while he embraces Kim Jong-un, Mohammed bin Salman, Vladimir Putin. This is not a normal situation. It's a crisis when the strongest country is not led by someone who actually believes in the alliance. I'm not a scaremonger or rumor monger, but I do read the New York Times reports, and it kind of strikes home to me that the president, the New York Times says, has debated with his advisors not just whether we should draw down the American military commitment in Europe, whether we should leave the alliance altogether. So our principal recommendation that Doug and I labored over and thought about, and Doug testified yesterday before Senate Foreign Relations on this, is that Congress needs to block the president. Check the president, which is one reason we were so glad to have Representative Slotkin here today. Congress needs to pass resolutions affirming their joint belief, Republicans and Democrats, that this alliance is still vital. Congress is going to do that in a resolution this week. We were in Munich together where we presented this report at the security conference, and Senator Jeanne Shaheen and others said, no doubt, if the president tries to either downgrade our military force structure in Europe or, in the worst case, remove us from the alliance, Congress would take action. And Congress, if you go from Munich, the 52 members there, is unified on this. So that's our principal recommendation. A second recommendation, obviously, and given the fact that the Bundestag decided yesterday that would actually decrease the German defense budget, not increase it in any way, with Germany at 1.24% of GDP, with only 5 of the 29 current members at or above 2%, there is a crisis in European defense spending and Canadian defense spending, and we can't get around this. It is an obligation for every member to hit at least the floor of 2% of GDP on defense spending, and we're worried, especially when the central, strongest economy in Europe, at the center geographically and figuratively of the alliance, is frankly so weak to carry out peacekeeping missions, to carry out humanitarian assistance, much less combat missions. And so there's got to be an effort in Europe to do this. Doug led this effort with President Obama. He'll talk about it, to try to get allies at Wales to commit by 2024 to 2%. We do believe the vast majority of them will get there. But if Germany doesn't get there and can't even get to 1.5% 5 years from now, that's going to continue to be a critical weakness of the alliance. In this case, President Trump is right, as was President Obama, as was President George W. Bush and President Clinton and H.W. Bush and every president of the last 40 years who said, look, we're spending, and our spending right now is, 3.5% of our GDP, around that level. American taxpayers are doing what they have to do. It's up to Europeans to meet us halfway given the threats. Now, we do say in the report that we believe this 2%, the methodology of how you get to 2%, it's very uneven. There is no common methodology to actually measure this. Countries use different ways to measure it. We think there should be a common methodology, number one. And number two, we think the alliance should broaden what fits under 2%. We're not in favor of putting aid, economic aid, under the 2%, but spending on cyber defense and cyber offense, spending on intelligence, kind of makes sense to us in the 21st century, given the Putin threat, that you'd want to do that, and that would be a more accurate way to measure it. Final point for me. We struggled with the question, what do we do with members of the alliance who are either authoritarian, anti-democratic. We dealt with this with the Greek colonels in the 60s and 70s, with Portugal for a time, with 2 Turkish military dictatorships in the 80s, where the alliance effectively didn't formally sideline countries but put them in a corner. We now have a crisis in Europe where the Hungarian government, definitely authoritarian, the Polish government heading in that direction, and the Turkish government anti-democratic and authoritarian. And we talked to current perm reps, the leadership of NATO, Europeans and Americans on both sides of the alliance. Everyone's concerned about it, but no one believes we can effectively do anything about it. You can't remove them because we're a consensus organization. Any country could just veto, not provide consensus to a resolution to kick them out. We propose in the report that NATO has to take this issue on, that we have to shine a light on the democratic practices of all countries, all the members, and maybe on an annual basis, ask a distinguished think tank in Europe or the United States. We were thinking about Freedom House, it could be CNAS, to take an honest, objective look at the democratic practices of each ally and report on it. It's not punitive, but it does get to the democratic basis of the alliance in the second line sentence of the Washington Treaty. It's all about human rights and the rule of law and democracy. And these 3 countries and part of the Italian government are obviously not living up to their democratic tendencies. Nearly everybody we talked to disagreed with us that we should even shine a light on the program. They thought it would be divisive militarily. We disagree with that. We think it's an important step to take.
So this has been a close collaboration over the last 6 months or so, and I've gotten to know Nick a lot better than I knew him before, and I've really been rewarded by that, I think. Thank you. Nick mentioned that when you serve as the U.S. ambassador to NATO, you have sort of a professional attachment to the institution that you didn't really anticipate when you first arrived at NATO, but it sort of grows on you, right? So to a certain extent, this report is scratching that professional itch of how is the institution doing. But beyond that, I think for both of us, there's a personal connection to NATO. And Nick mentioned he was the U.S. ambassador on 9/11/2001, a key inflection point for the alliance. I was there quietly in September 2013. I showed up. I thought, what could possibly go wrong? This would be a nice place to figure out what I'm going to do in the 4th quarter of my life after leaving the White House. And 6 months later, Putin took Crimea, then went into the Donbass, and a couple months after that, al-Baghdadi declared the caliphate on NATO's border in northern Syria and northern Iraq. So what I thought would be a rather easy, working with John and Jim, an easy last tour of duty in the federal government turned out to be a high adventure. So it was personal for me. As well. The one word in this 55-page report that got the most attention is the subtitle and the use of the word crisis. And, some suggested, doesn't it deserve a question mark? An alliance in crisis? Or do you really mean crisis? Because we've cried crisis before. So the Suez crisis, the Vietnam War challenge, the Euro missile crisis for NATO. So isn't this just kind of cyclical? And we were unsure about this. This is one of the last things we actually decided in the report. What should be the subtitle? And the reason we took the question mark away and retain the word crisis is because, as you read the report, there are 10 complex, very diverse, and simultaneous challenges before the alliance. And when you get up to 10, it seems to us that's a crisis, okay? So if you doubt the, sort of the hyperbole of the word crisis, read the report, okay? And if you, at the end of the 10 challenges, I think you'll settle where we're at. Now, Nick highlighted in his comments some of the challenges from within the alliance. So absence of U.S. presidential leadership, the challenge of defense spending, the challenge of the slippage or drift from core democratic values, and so forth. The alliance in the subsequent section talks about challenges from outside the alliance, so beyond NATO's borders. And here, the first one we identify, of course, is containing Mr. Putin's Russia. We applaud NATO for some of the steps it's taken in terms of improving its readiness, improving its deterrence posture, but we cite, in terms of deterrence, a gap. And while NATO has attended to, if you can imagine a visual spectrum, of the nuclear part of the deterrence spectrum and the conventional part of the deterrence spectrum, actually NATO has taken some pretty reasonable steps there. But where we're still short is in response to what the Russians would call active measures or hybrid warfare. And General Gerasimov just made news again recently by sort of redefining or re-emphasizing hybrid warfare. And here the deterrence spectrum is lacking. And we think that NATO is probably most vulnerable in this arena of hybrid warfare, and there's a lot more that can be done there. And as we do more there, those sorts of countermeasures ought to count against the 2% pledge. That's the first challenge from beyond NATO's borders. Another that we cite is that we believe it's time to end the war in Afghanistan. We applaud Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad's leadership in this regard. It looks like he's making some early progress. It's a long way to go. We have not yet arrived at the point where Afghans are actually talking to Afghans, if you accept the fact that Zal's an Afghan American, and that's not the Afghan we're talking about, right? We're talking about the Afghan government talking to the Afghan Taliban. And that hasn't happened yet, but it seems like we're in a period of opportunity for diplomacy, and we argue in the report that it's time to reprioritize and place the military campaign fully in support of the diplomacy, because for too many years it's been just the reverse, right? So we think there's a reprioritization that needs to take place in an effort to end the war in Afghanistan. We also address NATO enlargement, citing that, at the end of the Cold War, we had 16 members. That was in 89, 91. Just this week, in fact, I think yesterday or the day before, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the first 3 post-Cold War new members of the alliance. So Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic. And since the end of the Cold War, we've now added another 13, soon to be 14, with North Macedonia. So we argue that we've gone through a very intense period of enlargement over the last 25 years, and we suggest it's time to do some consolidation based on this rapid, relatively aggressive increase in the size of the alliance, and consolidation along the lines of, do these new members fully adhere to the democratic principles that we cite? In fact, of the 3 that are just celebrating their 20th anniversary, 2 of the 3 are cited in the report as drifting away from the core values, Poland and Hungary. So what does that tell us about the pace at which NATO has enlarged, and have we kept up with the qualifying requirements of enlargement, of new membership, which is adhere to the founding values of the alliance and able to contribute to the collective defense? So I think it's time to do some introspection in terms of enlargement. Certainly the door remains open. I mean, Article 10 of the treaty is not, we don't suggest changing Article 10, which is the open door article in the Washington Treaty, but we think it's time to do some introspection and take a careful look at where we are. We also cite the last 2 recommendations among the 10 are challenges that are not imminent, but they're on the horizon for NATO. So these are looming on the horizon, the way we state it. And there are 2 here. One is the emergence of a set of new digital technologies, which together might be called the third wave. I mean, Bob Work here at the CNAS talks often about the third wave of military technologies. But these quantum computing, 5G, biotechnology, and so forth, artificial intelligence, combine to suggest that we may be on the leading edge of a step change in military technology, and we're not sure, looking from the outside in at NATO today, that the NATO defense planning process is adequately agile enough to adapt and take account of these new technologies. We're also not sure that the member states, as they look to defense spending and in particular capital investment inside that 2% figure, how much goes to new equipment and so forth, whether those allies, or we allies, are adequately prioritizing these new technologies. So digital technologies are looming on the horizon. The other one in that category, on the horizon, has to do with the now obvious competition with China. We don't cite a military competition with China. We don't imagine that NATO is going to begin running flotillas of surface combatants into the South China Sea or something like that. But we do cite obvious trends in terms of Chinese commercial investment in Europe, in transportation infrastructure, in IT infrastructure. The latest, hottest topic is the competition for 5G networks, right? And of course, the Chinese make these commercial investments for commercial reasons, but there's a clause, there's a subclause, there's a subplot. And the subplot is commercial investments today lead to political influence tomorrow, right? And we're beginning to see some signs of how the Chinese expect a return on investment in their commercial investments in the political arena. And we think that it's time that NATO pay attention to this Chinese competition. And frankly, I'll close on this one, because the competition with China will, for I think the American audience, and maybe to Elissa's opening point, maybe recasting NATO as America's most geostrategic advantage over the next 20 years as we compete with China is the way to present NATO, less as a, we've got to defend to fill the gap sort of rationale, and more towards the competition on the horizon is this geostrategic competition, U.S. and China, and how does the U.S. want to enter that competition? Would we prefer to enter that competition alone with trade wars and tariffs and so forth, or would we rather enter that competition with 50% of the world's GDP on our side, which is the combination of U.S. and Europe, and enter it with 30 like-minded allies? And obviously the report opts for the second option. So let me stop there, but in short, we're happy to talk with our fellow panelists about any of these challenges, either within, beyond NATO, or on the horizon.
That's great. Thank you both. And that gives us a lot of fodder for our discussion. So we'll have a discussion here, and then in a little while I'll turn to the audience for questions. So be thinking about that brilliant question or comment that you'd like to ask anyone on the panel. But Kath, maybe I can start with you on this question of burden sharing, which has become sort of the keystone around which every discussion of NATO now takes place, and this 2% of GDP figure has become totemic in a way that I'm sure those who agreed to it probably had not fully intended. And if you actually look at the language, it says, work toward 2% over time and all this stuff, but it's became, they're not paying their bills. So 2 questions on this. One is, it does beg the question of what is the right way to value the worth of an ally, to measure the worth of an ally, right? So, after the United States, the NATO ally that spends the greatest percentage of GDP on defense is Greece. Now, no offense to our Greek friends, and we have an ambassador to Greece, a former ambassador to Greece on the panel, but Athens is not normally the first phone call that happens after a crisis. We would go to one of these, countries that's not paying as much for Greece, and then of course there's how you pay for it. So and then, beyond the numbers, niche capabilities, willingness to fight alongside the United States. So the one question is, how do you think about the worth of an ally? Second question is the president not onto something in the sense that, to the degree to which we do care about burden sharing, Secretaries of Defense for 30 years have gone to Europe and harangued them to increase their defense spending to no avail, and the numbers just continue to decline. But Trump has taken a different approach. So, maybe the polite, we're all in this together, you guys would really be nice to increase your defense spending and, come let us know when you've done it. It just doesn't work. And if you want those numbers to go up, you got to do a Trumpian version of this. So that's a question and a hypothesis, which, I would ask.
Well, let's start at the worth of an ally piece, and I really want to commend Nick and Doug for this great report. And picking up on Doug's last comment, I would go there first and foremost, which is the strategic value. The United States is in some form in a series of competitions in the world. People point mostly to the U.S.-China competition, but generally speaking, economically, security-wise, there is a lot going on in the world that requires the United States to position itself to advance its interests. Those aren't always security interests, and we don't have to lead, certainly, typically with our military foot. But having alliances with treaty commitments of mutual security is an enormous advantage that the Russians and Chinese, for example, let alone the North Koreans, the Iranians, don't have. To throw that out, that strategic advantage, to toss it overboard in this chase of dollars that are not ultimately the strategic point, is foolish. And that is what we are doing. And to think that we can control the domestic implications in foreign partner and ally countries, that causes, that message, that rhetoric causes over time, is equally foolhardy. So to your second point about isn't the Trumpian way, which I know is you're putting forth as a polemic, I'm not suggesting that it's your view, isn't that the smart way because we might get some more dollars? My answer is no, because the way in which we are going about it is fundamentally undermining our strategic advantages in the world. And if Americans want to have, the economic benefits of leadership, if they want to ensure secure seas and space and air to move goods and services, if they want to be able to use apps on their phone that are not controlled by an authoritarian state, these are all things that are alliances in the world that are values-based and interest-leaning. That's what we get out of them. I do want to say that I think it would not be fair to cast Donald Trump as the first to be maybe impolite in his terminology and use. I think Jim Townsend will recall well that Bob Gates's final NATO speech was rather zesty. And if you look back to even to the 1980s, a lot of this pressure on burden sharing was coming from the left, right? It was coming from the Pat Schroeders of the world and others who were looking for that peace dividend. This is not new to America. It's not wrong to the point that Nick and Doug made. Nick in particular made this point about we have to make sure for all our domestic publics that we have secure foundations for how we spend and what we spend on. But we can't lose sight of the big picture. Now, you also asked in there about the way to measure. And my team and I did a report last year before the Brussels summit on this idea of measuring value versus counting dollars. I honestly, if I had my way, I would leave the 2% behind. 2% was agreed to by allies because it was an easy, quick way to get out of a debate about what to do with NATO post-Afghanistan, what was seen at the time as post-Afghanistan. And so 2% was arrived at, formalized, I should really say. It had been discussed, obviously, for a long time, but arrived at in a formal way at Wales as a way to keep everybody on board. It probably served that purpose for some time, and now I think we're being hoisted on our own petard, which is to say what it did is sidestep to the issue of why do we have this military alliance, what is its fundamental purpose, how do we advance it forward. Here is where I think we're seeing some positive movement inside NATO in terms of the readiness initiative. But it's late, and I think it hits because it's late. We are in this crisis. So to the point of Greece, if you will, as an example. You look at the Danes, right, who've been early contributors, to the NATO campaigns, who have advanced their military force, and they're essentially punished, if you will, because they have a strong economy, right? So the worse your economy, the easier it is to get to 2%. That's a very perverse incentive structure that we have built. If you don't deficit spend, it's hard to get to 2%. Guess what the U.S. does to get to 2%, right? We deficit spend. So I think there are a lot of things that we put upon ourselves as an alliance because it's really hard to talk about the capability issues, and a lot of allies do not look good on the capability issues. But that is where we need to make progress.
Great. Andrea, let me come to you on this question of the democratic decline that is mentioned at some length in the report, and as Ambassador Burns talked about. And clearly, we do have an issue with Poland and Hungary and Italy and potentially other countries in the next few years. At the same time, NATO is a military alliance. You either have a security, a collective security provision, or you don't. Yeah. We have had the Portuguese dictatorship, the junta in Greece, and a couple of military dictatorships in Turkey, and sort of went through that without casting them in a different character by virtue of their political system. So how do you see that now? How should we deal with the Hungaries and the Polands and the Italys and others? And is this something that should really animate those who worry about NATO's future as a military alliance, or just those who hope that it has these ancillary political benefits of sort of uniting folks? And ancillary is a term that we could easily object to, but I'm trying to draw out a comment here. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks to Nick and Doug for the report, and it's been really fantastic to be able to support your effort in doing that, and we're happy to have you. So maybe to start with the second part of your question about whether or not it's a threat to NATO, because, I think as you noted in your remarks, it's one of the issues that's still debated in the community. Does it really matter? Is it a military alliance? Is it a political alliance? Is it both? And I think part of the debate stems from kind of the different threats that NATO faces. And I would say probably on the conventional side, that democracy maybe matters slightly less. And I say that because when you have these kind of clear breaches of Article 5, it's much easier to kind of come to consensus to be able to confront those types of threats. And whether or not you have democratic decline in places like Hungary and Poland, it probably matters less, because at the end of the day, like you said, Richard, if we can all agree that we're going to defend one another, then that's kind of all you need. But I would say a couple of words are in order, because at the end of the day, I really do see democratic decline as a very significant threat to the alliance. And I say that for a couple of reasons. Number one, as both of you highlighted, I think one of the likeliest and probably most significant threats to NATO comes from the sub-Article 5 and the hybrid threat. And when we're talking about those types of threats, then consensus about how to respond is of the utmost importance. And when Russia is doing these sub-Article 5 types of activities, they're designed to be ambiguous. They're difficult to attribute. They're designed to slow a response from the NATO alliance. And democratic decline and rifts between countries will further complicate that picture of consensus. And it's not only the rifts between countries that will make consensus hard, but I also think it's within the NATO member states themselves. As you have all of the polarization and disagreements within these societies, it's very difficult, I think, to generate a public consensus about the need to respond to the hybrid threats. So that's, I think, an important piece of this. The second piece is also about the resilience. And so if we all agree that the hybrid threats pose a significant threat to NATO, the democratic decline poses or increases the vulnerability of NATO member states to Russian overtures and Russian aggression. Russia is picking up on these fissures and divisions inside NATO member countries, and so we need to make sure that we're strong, resilient democracies in order to more effectively deter these threats from Russia. And then I think the final point is about perceptions. And so when we're talking about deterrence, perceptions matter. And so if Russia, when they're looking at NATO and particularly in Europe, if you have democratic decline in the polarization that I think Russia sees, and it was really remarkable, I think, at Munich this year when Lavrov was talking, he talked a lot about the new cracks emerging and old cracks that are deepening. These are opportunities that Russia sees, and if you have these sorts of divisions, all it takes is kind of a shift in the decision calculus from the Russians that might make them more willing to try to take these measures that eventually can undermine the credibility of the Article 5 deterrent. And so for all those reasons, I think the democratic piece is really significant to the coherence and the capacity and capability of the alliance. The much harder question is what to do about it, and I think you had some excellent opportunities that you laid out in your report, shining light on the ability of NATO member countries to meet their political agreements. You talked about some more punitive measures like excluding allies from exercises and training and maybe some of the infrastructure spending. But unfortunately, I'm not sure that NATO is the best kind of vehicle for addressing these types of threats. It makes it really hard. And so then I think that's when we start thinking about opportunities to link up with the EU, and really it just kind of putting some of the onus, I think, unfortunately, back on member states to start addressing these issues. I think maybe one area where more work and more creativity might be able to be done is thinking if there's things that NATO can do to address some of the root causes of democratic decline in Europe. So we know the migration crisis was a significant threat, some of the inequality in these societies. I don't know exactly what it is at this point, but if there are ways that NATO as an organization can start addressing some of the root causes, I think there could be some opportunities there.
Great. Nick, I want to ask you a question. I know you'll have thoughts on these other topics as well that you can add in, but from an alliance management standpoint, and you've been the person on the ground working in the North Atlantic Council, this alliance, you list number one in this report as lack of American leadership, and in your comments today you focused on what the president has said, both about Russia and about NATO and Article 5, and what he hasn't said. Now, defenders of the administration, including those in the administration, say, hey, look, you got to look at what we do, not just what the president says. And when it comes to NATO and Europe, the administration's putting more money into the European Reassurance Initiative than the Obama administration did. And who knows, we may have a base in Poland, permanent base in Poland, and we're moving men and material to the east. And on Russia, we sanctioned the Russians in a way the Obama administration declined to do, shut down consulates, provided lethal aid to the government in Ukraine, including Javelin, which the Obama administration declined to do. We've had a much harder, tougher policy toward Russia. So look at what we do, not what we say. Now, in a perfect administration, what you do is what you say, more or less. But we're not in that world today. So, for a lack of a better term, as an alliance management question, what trumps? Is it do our allies pay more attention and put greater value on the actions that I just described, or is there an irreducible quality to the president's words?
Well, first, Richard, I've supported, Doug has supported the sale of the distribution of javelins to Ukraine. I think President Trump was right to do that. He doesn't want to say this, and maybe President Obama doesn't want to acknowledge it. There's been an Obama-Trump policy. It began under President Obama to reinforce the American armored presence in Europe, because we had effectively hollowed out a lot of our big bases in Europe to fight the Iraq and Afghan wars back at the beginning of this century. And under President Obama's leadership and President Trump's leadership, we are rebuilding the American armored presence, as we should, to make a deterrence effective. So it's a Trump-Obama success. It's bipartisan, and we should celebrate that. But we have given credit to President Trump for the Ukraine initiative. It's not just rhetorical when you can't back up Article 5. It's meaningful, because as Andrea said, deterrence really is based on perception. It's the perception of the adversary. If you're the first American president in 70 years to swing and miss 3 times, 4 times at this basic question, do you believe in Article 5? And you fail to answer the question in any convincing way, or with Tucker Carlson you basically give Putin a pass for his attempted coup d'etat against Montenegro two or 3 years ago. That's meaningful. And frankly, I mean, I was willing to accept at the beginning of the Trump administration the line that comes out of the Trump administration: watch what we do, not what we say. We've had 2 years where the president has failed to do anything to strengthen the American commitment to NATO. In fact, it's been the reverse. So to me, those are, if you're not backing up Article 5, that's an action that the Kremlin is going to be paying attention to. So I find the president deficient on that. We are a military alliance. We are also very definitely, as the ambassador knows, Ambassador of Iceland, my friend Geir, we're a political alliance. And often at the NATO Council, we're not just talking about deploying troops to Afghanistan or joining the anti-ISIS coalition. It's about steps that we take as a political alliance to stand up to protect democracy in Europe. And right now, the biggest issue in Europe is the rise of the anti-democratic populists. The president is embracing them. He's embracing Viktor Orban. Mike Pompeo is too. And embracing the Polish government, and he's turned against our West European small d democratic allies. Those are actions. Those aren't just statements. So I don't think the Trump administration line is right about this. I think it's wrong. 2 quick comments. Yep. I will say, on the issue of this very difficult issue, how do you shine a light and even call on the carpet anti-democratic allies? More than one European said to Doug and I, if you guys go forward with this, your country's going to be under that spotlight. We said, we know.
It should be.
And it should be, and Americans should be willing to admit our faults. And certainly we've seen unprecedented attacks on freedom of the press, on the FBI, on the CIA, on the State Department, our fundamental institutions. We have enough self-confidence that Americans should respond to those questions and hopefully decide we're going to defend those freedoms. And my last comment on Kath, very good. I thought Kath really framed the 2% debate in a very intelligent way. Here's the good news, despite all the bad news. In the last 4 years, there has been real increases in the budgets of nearly every NATO ally. Now, they've been modest, but they're increases rather than reductions. Why? They start with Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014-15. They continue and maybe even accelerate after the Trump remonstrations. So we give President Trump credit, and we give Putin kind of perverse credit. We've been reacting to him. And President Obama deserves some credit. His administration worked hard on this. So again, I think both our last 2 presidents have focused on this issue in different ways, but they both made some progress.
Doug, let me turn to you on the recommendation you mentioned on Afghanistan, which is to end the war in Afghanistan. You probably know more about the war in Afghanistan than this entire room put together.
Unfortunately, that's right.
And so very interested in your thoughts. Maybe you can unpack that recommendation a little bit. And as I read the recommendation in the report, you and Nick are proposing to, or recommending to, withdraw American troops pursuant to a deal with the Taliban that would include a ceasefire and a commitment by the Taliban to engage with the Afghan government. Certainly that's desirable, but let's say ZAL diplomacy doesn't succeed in eliciting from the Taliban a credible agreement to do those things, pursuant to which we could then withdraw. What should we do then? Should we stay forever or indefinitely, or leave anyway?
Well, first of all, why are we here now talking about Afghanistan at the, this is 2019 after all, right? 18 years into this. A couple things have fundamentally changed. I mean, for the first time, as I've watched this, and I sort of joined the Afghan train in 2004, right? We have a position where all the key protagonists in the armed conflict really don't envision military victory. And you have the U.S. military leadership very prominently, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the last 2 ISAF 4-star commanders, U.S. commanders in Afghanistan, all admitting that this looks, feels, and smells like stalemate. Right? The Taliban, behind closed doors, admit the same thing. They know they're not going to march on Kabul. And so you have sort of this common ground now where nobody's imagining military victory. And I think that opens the door for diplomatic opportunities that Zal's pursuing. The key here is that we've got to have an agreement. I suppose this is sort of a characteristic of all delicate diplomatic agreements, right? Where everybody can declare victory in some way. Everybody can define the outcome, the diplomatic outcome, to his political advantage. For the Taliban, that means we must leave. I mean, the only thing that keeps these Taliban fighters in the fight in some under very nasty conditions, right, is this notion, this unifying notion, cohering notion of jihad against the foreign occupier. That's us. So clearly part of the equation here has got to be some sort of withdrawal plan on the American side. On our side, we've got to be able, with confidence, to say that the original objective for going to Afghanistan has been achieved. And that's no safe haven for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-like transnational terrorists who could strike outside Afghanistan. By the way, that's not the Taliban. The Taliban have no outside, beyond Afghanistan ambitions or capabilities. They never have. They've never once struck outside of Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda is still there, small remnants, and of course the Islamic State now has sort of a franchise in eastern Afghanistan, which is a concern. So we've got to be able to deliver our part of the narrative. The Afghan government, however, has also got to be able to deliver a stance that reinforces the new Afghanistan, the Afghanistan that has developed politically since the fall of the Taliban. And that's an Afghanistan that's founded on the Afghan constitution, that has a quite vibrant open press, that has a parliament, okay, no parliament's perfect, right, has an amazing increase in the participation of women and youth in the political culture of Afghanistan. So I'm not sure, in fact, I've talked to Zal, I'm not sure how he's going to pull this off, but all three of those narratives has to be addressed to at least a sufficient degree so that we can come out. My concern is not that we stay there forever, but that under a very unpredictable administration, we stay there until the next sort of Tuesday tweet that pulls us out precipitously. And then that not only breaks the chain of logic in terms of these narratives, right? We would, under those conditions, be giving the Taliban something and getting little in return, right? But it also defies the basic logic that has kept a NATO-led coalition in Afghanistan for all these years, and that is in together, out together. And so we would be not only damaging our relationships with Afghanistan and the Ghani government and the Afghan people, we would be violating a key tenet of NATO military operations. So there's a lot at stake here. And the good news is, in my view, is A, we have the common ground now. We sort of all agree we're not going to win this and dance in the end zone, right, with military victory. And B, we have Zalmay Khalilzad, who is, if there's one American diplomat who can pull this off, my vote's on Zal.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to go to the audience. So the last question I'm just going to ask, this for anybody in the panel who wants to field it, is about the nature of the Russian threat to NATO member democracies. So NATO is pretty good at thinking about Russian tank columns moving across into the Baltics. Less good, but getting there on gray zone activities when they have a military and intelligence character. But the Russian meddling in the 2016 election in the United States was a direct in my view, a direct national security threat. It was an attack on our democratic practice and our way of life. But it was seen as an American issue, not a NATO issue. Same with the meddling in the French elections. If to the degree to which there was, foul play in the Brexit referendum, British issue, not a NATO issue. Is that threat from Russia, which doesn't seem like it will be going away anytime soon, should that be within the ambit of what NATO takes on when it collectively works together to try to push back against Russian depredations and threats?
Without question. We still have, and we say in the report, Doug and I, we still have that traditional threat. We use the word contain Russia very advisedly. A lot of Europeans feel uncomfortable with that. They say, well, we want to contain, but we want to engage. Well, of course, we want to talk to the Russians about Afghanistan, North Korea, terrorism, counter-narcotics, INF. But I'm not sure engage is the right. We want to talk to them, keep the lines open. Why contain? Because Putin, Lavrov were trained in the Soviet system, and that's their mindset now. And it looks like they're going to rule at least through 2024, maybe beyond in that autocratic system. So until that generation passes literally from the Kremlin scene, we're in contain mode. And we have effective deterrence in place, especially with the rearming of the United States, with our strength in Germany, with the battalions in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But you can never count on having enough strength, and we've seen that the Russians are unpredictable in that conventional sphere. The new threat, Richard, is definitely the hybrid threat, the cyber offensives. Again, in terms of actions and words, the president has never stood up to Putin on this. He's never defended us on the attack on our election, but he hasn't done what I think any president would have done at the first NATO summit meeting, and that is say we have a common threat to the Dutch, to the Germans, to the French. Everybody in NATO faces the same threat. We have to erect defenses. We have to go on the offense. He's never done that at his level, so he's deficient in that, and that's the new threat that we have to deal with. We also talked in the report about the INF threat, and here we're very clear. This is not Donald Trump's fault. This is Vladimir Putin violating the INF agreement, but it's incredibly complicated, as you all know. If you want to have an effective, modern 21st century intermediate range agreement, you're going to have to include China and Iran and India and Pakistan. It's an entirely different set of negotiations than it was in 1987. So Russia is still very much at the heart of what NATO represents, which is why the mission is not yet complete. And our mission, in the words of H.W. Bush, our American mission has been for 30 years. We favor a Europe that's whole, free, and at peace. And that Europe cannot be sustained without NATO.
What you said.
Yeah, and then Andrea.
Quick point on this hybrid question. So I'm with Nick. I think NATO has a responsibility to back up national, first-order national responsibility to be more resilient and more resistant to these kinds of hybrid tactics, right? But this also highlights the importance of a NATO-EU relationship that is much closer than it is today. So if you just take cyber defense, for example, guess what? Both of these two European-based institutions have cyber standards for their member states, but if you set them side by side, they don't match. So, there's just a simple incoherence between NATO and the EU that ought to be replaced by the most natural partnership. 22 common member states, common geography, common challenges, and we're just not there yet. So in concern of the hybrid part of the deterrence spectrum, we really got to link up more closely with the EU. That's great.
Yeah, just the one thing I would say is that I think your question really cuts, though, at the heart of the challenge, is trying to understand what constitutes a challenge and a threat to Article 5 and what doesn't. And I know from, when Russia looks out, I still don't think that Russia has any territorial designs on Europe, and he still sees Article 5 as a credible deterrent to, to a particular set of aggressive actions. And the key challenge, though, is that they start chipping away at these small-scale things, and kind of like the frog in a boiling pot of water, we start getting closer and closer to Article 5, and eventually get so close that it kind of exposes, the unwillingness of NATO member states to organize and mobilize around Article 5. So I think that's really the threat, is trying to distinguish what constitutes a challenge to Article 5 and how do we respond to those threats. And I know, Kath, you at CSIS are working on a big project on the countering hybrid in Russia. So I think, like Doug, you said, a lot of this is going to be determined through closer NATO-EU coordination. And I know Kath and CSIS will also have a number of excellent recommendations for how to confront these types of challenges.